or the surface of the heart, or the structure. And so there's a lot of different things that you could argue a pin could be at. So the list is going to, when the heart is going to have its pins in it, and then there's going to be a little piece of paper here saying, number 1, what is this vessel? Number 2, what is this layer of the heart? Number 3, what is this structure here? Or something like that. So what is this chamber of the heart? So it will identify what you're looking for. So make sure you look at the chamber because, make sure you look at the paper because that will tell you how to answer the question rather than just kind of what it's pointing to. So I'll go through here, but I know the practical is not till next Monday, but just to kind of put people in mind of how it's going to go so that you can tell what pieces will be where. Okay, so the layers of the heart wall. The heart wall has 3 layers, just like the blood vessels that we looked at yesterday, although it doesn't have an outer adventitia. It's going to have an inner lining of what would be in a blood vessel endothelium, except it's the endocardium inside there. Then it's got a muscle layer. Most of the heart is muscle. The myocardium, which you can only see where it's cut open because the endocardium would cover the inside, and the outside would be covered by the epicardium. The epicardium is part of a serous membrane. So as this picture is trying to show, we have, let's get a plastic bag and kind of put this heart in a plastic bag. So the heart is in a sac like this, where we've got the fibrous pericardium and the serous fluid, and it's got a parietal layer and a visceral layer of the pericardium serous membrane. So here's the parietal layer, and here's the visceral layer covering the heart. So that means that the visceral pericardium is the same thing, really, as the epicardium on the outside. So in terms of a layer of a heart wall, it's really the epicardium. In terms of its functional ability to produce serous fluid and keep the heart in a frictionless environment, it's the visceral layer of the pericardium. So here's the epicardium. If I was going to pin here, so if it said what layer of the heart wall, I'd poke it anywhere on the outside for asking for epicardium, anywhere on the inside asking for endocardium, and to do the myocardium, I'd have to go right into the muscle where it's cut open, because that's the only place that you can actually see the myocardium. So that would be the layers of the wall. You can see, even from this picture, that the myocardium is most of it. From here, you can see how it's really paper thin on both sides, and the muscle is virtually the whole thing. So then we go to heart areas and surface structures, which is a little bit of a vague description, but just orienting ourselves. Here we're looking at the heart from the front here. So that means this is the left side, because this is my left arm here, this is my left side of my heart, and this is my right side. So if you're looking at it from the back, of course, it'll be slightly different, but here I'm looking at the left side of the heart over here and right here. So the base and the apex. The apex is the point. So if you've ever played a game of cards, you know hearts are pointed on the bottom. And so normally the apex is like the peak of a mountain or something, but in this case the apex would be the point is pointing downwards. So that makes this the base. And I'm sure heart surgeons love to talk about the base and everything. There's so much other stuff going on here that I'm not really going to ask for the base because there's just too much other stuff to point to. Apex would be a reasonable one. So would the interventricular sulcus. So the 4 chambers of the heart, we haven't quite got to them yet, but to explain why they're called an interventricular sulcus. We have 2 collecting chambers at the top. If I go over here, 2 chambers where the blood is flowing in here, and then 2 chambers on the bottom for squeezing and pumping the blood out. Why do we need 2? Well, because we've got deoxygenated blood returning from the body on the right, which gets squeezed out to the lungs. It returns as oxygenated blood on the left and gets squeezed out to the body. So we want to keep those separated, otherwise we're having a lot of inefficiency mixing them together. So the bottom ones are the ventricles, and the top ones are the atria, kind of like a little atrium roof on the top. So interventricular sulcus, a sulcus is a groove, if we remember from 231 in the brain. So here's the interventricular sulcus. This would be the anterior interventricular sulcus, and goes around here. Here's the posterior interventricular sulcus. Not quite as convincing, perhaps, but there it is. Is that really between the ventricles? Well, the left ventricle is much larger and thicker than the right ventricle, because the left ventricle is trying to pump all the way around the body, pretty short distance to the lungs. Right ventricle has it easy. So those are the interventricular sulcus. They're for blood vessels. A good place for blood vessels to run because they're not getting stretched around quite as much if they go right between the chambers. The other place where they might go is the atrioventricular groove, or coronary sulcus, which forms what you might call an equator around here, underneath here, between the atriums and the ventricles. So, not exactly an equator, because that northern hemisphere is a lot smaller, the atria much smaller. So, but it goes around this way. The coronary sulcus is another word for it. And we'll see one thing that's in there a little while later on. So the four chambers. This is the right-hand side. I've got the right atrium up at the top here, and it says "and auricle." The auricle is this thing, it's with an AU, not like the oracle at Delphi or something, but the auricle, in other words, meaning that it looks like an ear, and it does look like an elephant ear kind of thing. It's just like a little expansion chamber where the blood can collect. The left has an auricle as well. So there's the left atrium and auricle, there's the right. Here's the right ventricle, and here's the much thicker. So note thickness, much thicker on the right. On the left, much thicker on the left. So we sort of did the chambers and the heart areas together. So any questions so far? No, we haven't really got there in lecture yet. All right. So vessels entering and leaving the heart. Somewhere here there's sort of a thing which shows the vessels. So I've got the right atrium. The right atrium is here collecting deoxygenated blood. So I'm going to have anything bringing blood back from the body. So looking at it round from the rear here, I've got two major vessels, one coming in from the top and the other coming up the back of the heart and going in here. But we can see that these go into the right atrium, and if I kind of push down through there, you can see that it goes down to the right ventricle. So superior vena cava is collecting mostly from above the diaphragm, especially the chest, head, and arms. And then the inferior vena cava comes up from the legs and abdominal and lumbar regions and comes in there. So those two are entering there. There's a third vessel entering the heart into the right atrium, and that's from the heart itself. So blood that gets squeezed out of the heart muscle has to go somewhere while the heart is squeezing, and it goes into here, at the back of the coronary sulcus, or atrioventricular groove. We've got a vessel here, a storage vessel for when blood is squeezed out, but the heart's busy squeezing, so it can't really fit in very well. So it's going to, this is called the coronary sinus. So back there, we can see that this part of the groove is hollow, and that's all collecting from all of these veins, and then it's going to dump, as we can see, into the right atrium. The left atrium, pretty much the only thing that can enter the left atrium is veins that are coming back from the heart. So they're veins, because they're returning to the heart, they're oxygenated because they just came back from the lungs. So from the lungs, we would be having oxygenated blood entering. So we just got to look and see where it goes. So this great big hole, and to some extent this one too, it looks like they all come into here, but this we can say definitely these are going into this side of the heart, and here these are going down into the left-hand part of the heart there. So in a human model, let's just take a look at this human model, which won't be on the practical, but will be on the final. So here's the here's the right atrium, inferior vena cava, and superior vena cava, and going down to the right ventricle down here, which will then send its blood to the lungs. You can see the coronary sinus collecting here, and it doesn't really have a hole going in there, but we can imagine it will go in there. And then over here, and I'm not sure why they're purple instead of red on this model, but here's the left atrium, and we've got vessels coming in. So there's actually two pulmonary veins bringing oxygenated blood from each side. In here, I don't know if the pig does have two from each side, but they always seem to be kind of chopped apart. So pretty much anything, if I were to say what vessel is this, and poke it so that the thing goes into this side of the chamber, then you'd say, okay, well that's a pulmonary vein. So this would be the superior and inferior. There's not much of it there, but if I was to say what vessel is this, then it would be the inferior vena cava, and this would be the superior vena cava. Leaving the ventricles, we only have one major vessel going from each one, because it's squeezing with some considerable force. We've got a large elastic artery coming out. So on this side, the right-hand side, if I follow up here, that's this vessel. So this vessel here is the pulmonary trunk going to the lungs. It's going to split into the left and right pulmonary arteries quite soon. Over here, this one's a lot harder to, maybe it's almost easier to go down. Let's see if I can. Yeah. Okay, so if I do this, if I go down this way, you can see that starting from the left ventricle and going up through all there, I'm emerging here in this vessel that has little arteries coming off it, fairly significant ones. And so maybe on this one you can see that a bit better. So those are vessels coming off. This is the aorta, and then these are some vessels coming off of it there. So in the human, we actually have three vessels coming off the aorta, and they're named on here. So it says branches off the aorta. Since they're really not visible and not the same permutations, well, number 5, you won't have to do for the practical. By the time we've done the vessels, we'll know them. So I'll just point them out on here. So this is the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian. Won't have to know that for the practical at all because the pig only has 2 vessels and it's different. So the coronary arteries we can see on here, but again we won't have to do that for the. So for example, here's a coronary artery coming off, and here's another one coming up. So they come off the aorta as well because they're supplying the heart. You can't really exactly see them or pin them very well on here. So again, that's something that eventually we'll know for by the time we've done the vessels, but for right now it's more of an FYI, number 5 there. So the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, we'd certainly want to know those, and the aorta is recognizable because it has vessels coming directly off the top, whereas the pulmonary trunk doesn't. It's going to split into a left and right to go to the 2 lungs. How are we doing so far?